Okay, folks, this is Artistic Development number one, part one of a multi-part series of talks and ideas that I'm going to be asking you to pay attention to. So we begin with the general question, what is it? What is artistic development? And there's several different answers, but I want you to be aware of a broadly speaking, a basic answer around what the purpose is. And we could talk about the history and about how it was developed and so on. And those are great ideas, and I would love for you to know that. I'd love for you to be interested in that. But the basic idea is that artistic development is a way of thinking about how children evolve through various stages. And remember, we're not going to use that word, we're going to use the word phases instead. So how children evolve through various phases of art making and thinking about their art making. The theory was derived from research from many decades, 80, 90 years at this point of research. Basically, folks wanted to understand how children grow emotionally and personally, interpersonally, and how that might be visible in their artwork, and whether or not the looking at children's artwork could help psychologists and artists and teachers and parents understand their children, children's emotional growth. One of the things that interests me in looking at children's art is how much we learn about what they're thinking about as we look at their art. The question is to us is that what does artistic development look like in practice? And we'll be talking a lot about practice throughout the semester. It's helpful to think about artistic development as a framework that helps us order and organize what we do in classrooms. Generally speaking, frameworks always help us order our behaviors. A framework can come in many different dimensions. A framework, for example, for helping us organize the way we drive our cars on the highway, on the street, is that we drive on the right. In the United States. That's a framework. The idea of a framework is not necessarily that it's like gravity. Gravity is some sort of a cosmic universal of the entire universe. That's not generally the idea necessarily. So, for example, driving on the right-hand side of the road could be considered to be a framework. It's a decision made to organize driving, to make driving better, safer for everybody involved. I want you to think about frameworks in your own life. Another example, sort of silly, is your dresser, your chest of drawers in your room. Which drawer do you keep your socks in? Which drawer are your shorts in, and so on. You can think of a set of drawers as a way of organizing a framework for how you keep your stuff, your clothes. We're going to use the framework of artistic development to talk about the changes in children's art making. Now, in schools, there's all different ways that things get organized, by where things are in the building, where things are in the classroom, by the time of day certain things happen and other things don't happen. Teachers will enact their curriculum based on an organizational framework that they've been inherited. Perhaps they've been told to use it, or they might invent it. But in other words, the choice of a framework is not always an individual choice. It's not a free choice a lot of times. But importantly, just because a teacher might not understand or really be able to talk about the framework that she's using, that she's engaging in, doesn't mean there is no framework. There's always a framework. Frameworks are sometimes unstated or implied or unconscious, subconscious. Artistic development really isn't any different in this respect. But for art teachers, one of the values of studying children's art making is because it helps us build a framework that's anchored on the child, that's directly related to the child, the learner who's in your classroom. It's not arbitrary. It's not a bunch of standards made up by people who've never watched children. So, the one I want to leave you with, or what I want you to think about, not leave you with, I want to start you with beginning to think about the learner, to focus our understanding of art and art education on the learner. So artistic development really begins with looking at marks, taking mark making seriously, really super seriously. The idea here is that if you've been around children, you've had your own child, or you've been able to watch a child grow up, you'll know that Children younger than 2 years old really begin making marks with anything that they can grasp, a crayon, a Sharpie, a pen, a ballpoint pen. They really enjoy it. It's kind of like a physical experience of movement that they can eventually they connect with an observable result. First they're moving things around, they don't even recognize what's going on. Then mom comes in and starts screaming, "The couch is now ruined," or "The wall has paint all over it." And eventually the children pick it up. Then when they do this with their hand, when their fingers are when their hand is holding that, it gets mom real excited. "I want to keep doing it. That's really cool." So children learn that their marks have a specific reaction in the world. They get a reaction. Children are really incredibly flexible, and they move from one idea to another. While talking to themselves, while they're moving things around in front of them, whether it's blocks or crayons. So eventually their mark making begins to communicate really specific ideas about what they want or who they are, where they live, and so on. There's a number of things then that are important. So this slide represents something that we might begin to separate out, and how these pictures look very different. There's people in the pictures, but the elements of the picture, what kinds of colors are being used, the number of lines, the number of shapes. The basic notion that's come from research in artistic development is that art capacities run parallel to the growth and development of the child, as social, emotional, physical, cognitive ways of being and becoming a human. Now remember, we start with the basic idea, the radical idea: children are human. Children are fully human. They're not partly human. They're not becoming more human. They're fully human with all of the wondrous, amazing, awesome features of humanity already there. They're always already part of that conversation, that human conversation. Okay, so within that, then that pushes back a little bit on the idea of development, but development and change we still see development and change. What we're doing with artistic development is what artistic development asks us to do to begin with is to look really carefully at the marks that the children are making. Ask ourselves, what do we notice? What's different between the drawings? So these pictures right here are a good place to start. Just asking yourself, what do you see that's different from picture to picture? Now here's the thing. These pictures are all drawn by first graders in the same classroom. The teacher prompted them to start drawing, asked them to start drawing by talking about people who were important in her life. She then asked the children to think about people who were important in their own lives. And then finally, she invited the kids to start drawing pictures of those people. Now, you can see the vast difference in the way the figure has been rendered in these drawings, the amount of detail and so on. The thing is that as much as artistic development is a window into each child's mind as the child is learning, it also gives you as a teacher a hint about what's coming up for you and the different abilities, the different skills, the different cognitive, emotional, social behaviors and desires and needs that each child has. And you can begin to see some of this in drawings that are going on. Now, it's really important to remember that, like I was saying before, the reason why we're thinking about phases and not stages and not steps or ladders is that we do not want to get caught in the trap of thinking that children's learning is one direction, unidirectional, and a linear path. It's just not accurate for so many reasons, and we'll talk about this more as we go. So the idea of phases then is something that it's going to be specific because, and I think of it sort of like in physics. And if you've watched water boil, in physics, when we think about the phase change of a substance as water begins to boil, it changes from liquid water into water vapor, gas. That's a phase change. But if you watch the water boil, the water doesn't just pop into boiling like all of a sudden it's just perfectly flat surface and the next second it's a bubbling roll. That's not what happened. It's gradual, 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 gradual. So for me, I like the idea of phases, thinking about phases, because we can take advantage of that transition zone. The threshold is not a one or a on or off transition. It's not stepping up one step. It's so gradual. It's a lot more like a ramp in that regards, but I don't even like ramps either. I just want to go with these fuzzy circles. So these are the basic ideas that we have here. Mark making capacities run parallel to the growth and development of experiences in social, emotional, physical, and cognitive realms. This is one of the major takeaways of artistic development, the theory of artistic development. And another one is that children develop at different rates and they may waver between phases over the course of short or longer times. So we cannot make definite predictions about what's going to happen next with a child. But there is the suggestion or the implication that things might follow some sort of a pathway. So this is the artistic development pathway. And you will read that these are called stages in some of the readings that we'll be doing, and you'll come into the idea because artistic development is it's in the family of developmental stage theories, as I've talked about previously. But these are the stages, these are the phases, these are the various rungs on the ladder, these are the various changing points between water freezing or water boiling and so on. As we move from one way of thinking or one way of thinking in the materials to another way of thinking in the materials. Now, it's very important that you memorize these names, and it's very important that you understand some of the dynamics. But basically, we're going to go through the gestural and generative. Now, gestural and generative, the very first phase, so like when a baby can just begin to hold on to something, even accidentally hold on to something, it has been called by Lowenfeld and others scribbling. Now, here's another word that I don't like, and I hope this makes sense, but the reason why I don't like scribbling is because often when we talk about scribbling, we're thinking about uncontrolled, meaningless behaviors. Oh, that's just scribbling. That doesn't make any sense. That's scribbling. And I really think that's wrong. I don't believe that that's the experience the child is having. It's not a nonsensical, just screwing around kind of a situation. It's a meaningful act. It's an act of meaning making. So I don't like the word scribbling because the implication often is that it's not meaningful. It's not meaningful behavior. And I frankly think that's just wrong. That's not what's happening with young children. So then we go to the manipulative, the pre-schematic, the symbol making, or also called schematic, and the pre-adolescent, where we recognize realism, recognize the desire for realism, to the pseudo-naturalistic, where we're actually able to, we have the skills and we have the behavioral understandings of drawing realism. So, like I said, these are very important names of categories. But now, the thing about categories is that they begin by noticing the components of the category. So let's look at a couple of images of a few of these different categories. And I want you to go back in through here, and you've seen that there are galleries of children's artwork that I've posted, and they're linked through the website, through the Canvas website, and they're on Google, and there's places for you to find them. I want you to make flashcards for yourself, for example, and flip the pictures in front of you and practice noticing and naming what you see. And then after you notice and name it, then, okay, last step, you categorize it. So some of the things that we notice in the very beginning is that children begin to think about their marks as the paper is a target for their action, but it's not a very concentrated target. Their limited motor control and their limited ability to grasp the mark-making implement means that often the marks they're making, the color splotches, they're veering off the paper. They're at the edge, they're kind of uncontrolled, they're moving all over the place. They feel very random or inconsistent, and the colors and the marks don't have much of a relationship to them. So that's one characteristic. And I'm always going to ask you, what else do you notice? What can you name? I see yellow, I see blue, I see splotches of red. I want you to name things specifically, practice naming things specifically. Okay, so in this example right here, this is made by a 2-year-old. And what I'm noticing is that there's blue marker, it's a crayon or maybe oil pastel, it's layered on top of these green or black brush strokes. And they appear as though it looks to me like the blue marks are on top of the black or green marks, but they kind of look sort of purposeful in a way because they sort of follow the gesture of the paintbrush mark. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but rather than the blue kind of veering off the page in every direction, it does veer off the page in some directions, but not in other directions. And I find that potentially interesting. It might indicate that the child's moving past this first phase of artistic development. She's got greater control of the mark-making implements. Now, I wouldn't say that this is proof by any means. This is not about proving something about where children are, not at all. All right, it's one observation of the material. But as I'm working with the child, if this child was in my room, in my classroom, or if this child was my daughter or my niece or somebody who is close to me, a neighbor, I might be able to follow the child's development in working with various materials. Okay, the next phase, the manipulative phase is what we call it. Now, the manipulative phase is when children begin to get a little bit of control and they begin to notice what's going on with their mark making, and they begin to exhibit some specific intent around keeping all the red in one place, almost something to this extent. So we notice that the children really recognize that they are making marks. The rhythm and the pleasure of making marks is even more apparent than it was earlier, and it seems to be that self-reflection, the ability to notice what they're doing, is also really pleasurable. We notice children tracking their marks with their eyes. They want to experiment more with materials, and they also start making more noise as they work. Things like the dog barking, or zoom, 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 or things like this, that you'll see that they're beginning to connect their experience with the act of making marks. Okay, now in this case here, I'm beginning to notice something quite intriguing. This is by a child who's 4 years old, and I noticed that the yellow and the oranges, there's a sort of a regularity. I noticed that the space between those marks is kind of consistent. The colors are kind of consistent, and that the diagonal, the way they're shaped, the way that they're flowing is kind of consistent. So, and this makes me think the child is paying attention to these particular characteristics. This is a hallmark of a child who is very well in the middle of a manipulative phase, and there's an this increased control over the way the color and the space is mattering on the paper. Makes me think the child might be moving toward the next phase, the pre-schematic phase. Now, look, there's a very different material. It's the same child, Clara, 4 years old, but look at the material. Now, in this case, it's buttons and glue. And it's not paint, and the child's working quite a bit differently, it seems to me. There's a randomness, there's a scatteredness. Now there's a shape going on, but the positioning of the buttons feels a lot more random than the painting did before. The glue is not as controlled as the paint was, and this is a very important consideration to keep in mind. Always keep this in mind, is that you have a variety of things happening when you move from one material to another. The skills and the meanings that you associate with watercolor paint or tempera paint are not going to transfer directly to buttons and glue. And especially when you're a very young child, it's a very playful way of very purposefully exploring and playing very intently with these different materials. But you do get a sense of where people are in their development and when they move from one material to another. So these are some images of moving to other materials as well. Now we come to the pre-schematic phase. Now, when a child reaches this phase, a little bit older, we see more grouping of colors. We see that dots, purposeful dots, start to appear in the drawings, in the mark makings. Enclosures start to appear. So lines, they have enough control over the way that they make lines that they're beginning to make regular shapes. And a lot of times those regular shapes enclose other aspects of the drawing. We start to see really purposeful language. So zoom, zoom, zoom really begins to get associated directly with the way a brush is moving across the paper, as an example. Or a dialogue about mommy and daddy and brother and sister will start to come out as figures are being drawn. Now remember, I always want you to ask yourself, what else are you noticing? What are you noticing? Now, this is a very important part of a child's a child's development with drawing materials or art making materials of any kind of thinking. We're looking at the way that the cognitive structures of the mind are changing, are evolving as the child matures, as the child continues to have the opportunity to practice and play with materials. Now, in this particular case, I'm going to be asking you to very carefully distinguish between the way that one phase transitions to another phase and where we begin to see the evidence of that. So on the picture on the left, I see these enclosures. These enclosures have these circles, these blue circles and the red circles. They have a regularity about them in a way, especially the red circles. The red circles really feel like they're consciously the same shape. Notice that the blue circles don't really have a circular notion as much as they have a kind of a pointy edge at one point, but the pointy edge is also consistent. Then also notice that at the bottom right-hand corner you have yellow circles, and you have yellow circles inside yellow circles. And then, of course, we have the larger yellow oblong that's enclosing the blue shaded in, and the blue that has the red next to it. This consistency of circle making, shape making, tells me that the child is very comfortable, very, very comfortable with making enclosures. And this is a hallmark of the pre-schematic stage, where shapes are regular, but they don't exactly begin to look exactly the same all the time. Now compare that to the drawing on the right, where I think immediately we see a little girl, maybe two little girls, a cat, a dog, maybe a house, and a heart. There's a story evolving in a way that, to my mind, is nearly transparent. The picture on the left, I'm not really sure. In fact, as I look at it more and more, I think I might see a person with legs, or I might see a dog or an animal. I think I see maybe the child has drawn a name, perhaps. But I can't be sure, although looking at the picture on the right and noticing that Kimberly has drawn her name, then it makes me think that maybe Matt, that is Matt's name. So the idea here is that as the child transitions, kind of moves to the away from the pre-schematic phase with all of its careful acquisition of skills and behaviors, the child begins to make pictures that directly point to experience. So clear to me, look at the way the regularity of those squares, those color squares at the top, and the red and the yellow and the blue. So the grouping of colors, the enclosures, the purposeful language, and then what else do you notice? What else do you notice? Now, as we go into the schematic phase, the child has begun to be able to make regular groupings and regular lines and regular shapes. And those lines and shapes really begin to point to the world around that child. So in this particular case, I noticed these oblong enclosures. They're being treated in a very similar way, with lines at the top and kind of emptiness at the bottom. There's smiles and eyes, quote unquote, because I feel like I can call them that because they're predictable places. They're in a predictable part. They're at the top. So I really, I feel pretty confident that I can believe that the child is not making random crazy marks that have no meaning whatsoever, but the child is making marks that point to faces. Now, if I was in the room at the time, then I might be even more confident about what's going on, because I would have heard the child be talking about mommy and daddy and the dog, or so on. But I can be pretty comfortable assigning this, assessing this as a family portrait because of the drawing itself. What I can see in the drawing itself. So this is potentially an example of a child that's hovering right in the gray zone between phases, right at the threshold between pre-schematic and schematic picture making. The enclosures are predictable, right? Controlled using a pencil. Concentric circles of the eyes is what I noticed. And also there's a erasure of a prior drawing that makes me think the child wanted a different shape than maybe he or she was able to actually achieve. So they're becoming really, really clearly focused on the way shapes connect to each other. These are indications that the child is beginning to think about how things relate to the world. Notice that in this case here, using a very different material, the way the marks are put together, overlaps in the various shapes of things is very, very different. I would expect this child with a pencil would be making a drawing that looks very much more closer to the schematic than this ragged, the way that this collage is ragged and a little bit uncontrolled. Saying that over and over again, the question to you is, what do you notice? What characteristics of color, form, design, what elements do you notice? What shapes are evident to you? As we go through the process, we begin to get a better idea of when a child has a definite concept of form, how they begin to carefully visualize the lines and the shapes. Things get repeated, like the triangle for the body of the girls. Things get repeated like the body of the animals, like the round circles for the feet. At this stage of their development, and see, the word stage is very much a part of the dialogue around development, and you'll hear me say it, even though I consciously don't want to say it. But at this place where children are, they're really beginning to organize their artwork, and things start to line up at the bottom of the page on like a line, a horizontal line. Another thing that starts to happen is that this repetition starts to be taken to an extreme. So, for example, these M's floating through the sky are representations of birds. Clouds look the same. Notice you got a lid. The sky becomes a lid. The ocean becomes a line at the bottom. The children are symbolizing parts of their environment in a very descriptive way. This is part of what we mean by the word schema. We have a shape, we have a set kind of combination of shapes or a form that means something in the world. In this case, M means bird. That's characteristic of the schematic phase. So this is another example of first grader, and you can see what's repeated from one image to the next, the lines, the shapes, the eyelashes, the way the smile is, the triangle for the dress, and so on. Now the children, they're organizing their work in this way. It's extremely important to recognize that they are telling a story and that they are really very involved in the process of telling that story. There's a lot more to say here. Language, how the writing starts to appear. This is very important because I might recognize that the language, the writing, is indicating the child's ready to become more specific in the drawing, right? She wants to point to something that's very precise in the world. So this figure here is not just any figure, this is Dad. So I have to label it as Dad. Now this is, for me, sometimes it's a recognition that the child is beginning to intuitively understand that drawing or painting or art making can in some cases point to something very, very specific. So this does not, this picture of Dad does not identify Dad as a particular person. At parent-teacher night, you would not recognize Dad. The guy walks in, you say, "Oh my God, I recognize you. Your head is so round and your hair is just over on the side, just like it is in the drawings. I recognize you anywhere." Obviously, that's not the point. That's not what's going on. But what I do think is happening, potentially, is that the child is moving through these phases. It's a social, organizational learning process. It's not totally individual, although there is an individual aspect to it, but it's socially organized by the people around her, including her teachers and her friends. And so she's beginning to become perhaps a little impatient with the images that aren't recognizable in the way that she knows other images are recognizable. So maybe that has something to do with adding the language. Plus also, she's practicing her language. She's practicing her letter forms. So these are some of the characteristics of the symbol making or the schematic phase. And again, I want you to memorize these characteristics. I want you to expand them by reading and by looking carefully at children's artwork so that you are able to look at the work around you, look at what children are doing, and be able to talk to the child about it. This is one of my favorites of this presentation. What do you notice about these shapes? What do you notice about the combinations of shapes and the combinations of materials, the combinations of mark making? What do you think that maybe the child wants us? What kinds of stories do you think the child is inviting us to tell when we look at this work, when we talk with her about it. Okay, so that's the end of section number 1, part number 1, the introduction to artistic development. Onward to section number 2. Thanks.